Hey everyone, welcome to Love with Francesca, where we deep dive into relationships, self-love, and the empowering journey to authentic connection and healing. Today, I'm interviewing an incredible woman who I was lucky to meet through a program that we did together. Her name is
Mhm.
Anne. Welcome, Anne.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Thanks for being here. And thank you for impromptu being like, yes, I will speak on this and signing up immediately. So that got me really excited. I was just telling you a lot of people agreed to sign up, and it just felt like just such good timing. I've been wanting to do this for a while. And the fact that
Yeah.
some people signed up, there's a lot of things that I've tried to launch in the past year, and this is the only one that I launched, and it was an immediate like, yes, yes, yes. And I was like, seems like this is the thing I needed to do.
Yeah, it must be in
So
alignment.
it must be an alignment. So,
Mhm.
let's get started. So, tell me a little bit about you, the work that you do, and what inspired you to specialize in what it is that you do.
Yeah. So I am a licensed clinical social worker and based out of Colorado. I own and run a group therapy practice. We have 7 therapists on my team right now, and we specialize in working with women who have experienced trauma, typically some kind of relational trauma or developmental trauma. That is impacting the way they're showing up in the world today in a way that is unpleasant or frustrating, or they're really looking for more insight into other ways of doing their life, maybe that are different than what's been modeled for them before. I got into this work in kind of like a long and windy road, which I think is the case for most of us through
Yeah.
a lot of experience. So both personal experience and professional experience. I've always really gravitated towards helping others and being in some sort of role where I was assisting or supporting a larger mission of wellness, whether that was through public health or through child welfare. And then like for most people, COVID changed a lot of things for me and really brought me towards this direction where I could experience and feel and see the impact of working individually with adults and teenagers and helping them realize their truest self, so they could live lives that felt aligned with what they were supposed to be doing on this planet.
Mm. Oh, that's so beautiful.
Yeah,
So, how
thanks.
long have you been a therapist for?
Yeah, I started practicing part-time as a therapist in 2019. I've been a social worker and practicing social work unofficially since 2004 when I was working in public health or supporting people in public health, and then in more formal social work positions starting in 2009, and then transitioned into more clinical roles in 2019.
That's so interesting. Oh my gosh, I'm trying to not go off topic, but there's so much I want to dig into that about because I think it's really cool how you went from such macro concepts of like
Hmm.
public health and child welfare to and well-being, I assume, to like the
Hmm.
micro
Hmm.
clinical working individually
Hmm.
with a person. That's got to be so different, I would imagine.
It is. It also offers me a lot of perspective and insight into what my
Yeah.
clients are experiencing outside of my office, which is really important to me. It
Hmm.
also gives me better insight into these larger systems that really influence our day-to-day
Hmm.
life and well-being and decision
Yeah.
making.
Yeah,
Mhm.
100%. I remember when I worked as in in-home therapy for 2 years before I
Mhm.
got my master's. And I was so happy
Yeah.
to do that because I got the hands-on experience of like, what is it actually like to sit with a client and
Sure.
support them, you know? And I remember
Uh-huh.
asking around, it was also great because I had a bunch of coworkers who had already gotten their masters. So I just kind of picked their brain on what are the different masters that you can get. I just want to help people, one-to-one relationships, things like that.
Yeah.
And a lot of them, I almost went in the social work direction because a lot of them were like, counseling is great, but counseling sometimes you only stay really with
Yeah.
the individual. You focus so much on like the diagnosis and the pathology and the individual and what they're
Mhm.
going through. But the social work allows you to look at the environment, not just the home environment, but like the bigger macro environments that someone's living
Yeah.
in. I ended up being really lucky because my program that I went to was for mental health counseling, but they did take into consideration the
Hmm.
social and cultural
Hmm.
factors that were influencing
Hmm.
people. And especially for the type of work that you do, if you're helping women with trauma, like you're
Hmm.
mostly seeing the ways in which systems in our society are probably failing these women in some sort of
Hmm.
way. Obviously, there's the interpersonal trauma that can happen in the home
Hmm.
or in the
Hmm.
workplace, but I mean, there's much bigger levels of trauma that are happening. And the fact
Yeah,
that you probably had those experiences, I would imagine allows you to like bring all that wisdom into the room and
mm,
help this woman realize like, oh, it's not all my fault that I can't handle my emotions. It's like I
that's
live in a
right.
society that's just like weighing me down a lot, especially depending on, whatever, whether it's the social class that you come from or the
Hmm.
race that you are, or, if you're
Hmm.
part of a minority group. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think about these systems and they're inherently can feel really oppressive to people or limiting to people, and how often that turns itself into maybe like a little pressure cooker, which is
Yeah.
also part of what we saw happen or what I experienced happen during COVID as well, where it was like, not only are we magnifying these spaces that felt really hard but manageable before, it now feels like really close and really tight and really hard and really constricting. And
Yeah.
that is only exacerbated when we come to the table with our own life experiences that may have impacted how we show up in the world, like people who have experienced trauma.
100%. 100%.
Yeah.
So, for those that don't know that may be listening to us now, can you outline like I'd love to talk about the spectrum of trauma because now,
Yeah.
on social media we talk a lot about trauma this and trauma that. And sometimes as, trained
Hmm.
mental health counselors, I'll say like
Hmm.
sometimes I get a little frustrated when I hear people say, "Oh, I've been traumatized." And I'm like, "No, that was just a stressful situation, you know?"
Hmm.
But then there
Hmm.
really are trauma. So
Yeah.
maybe talk to
Yeah.
us a little bit about that.
For sure. So I think on a global sense, we think about trauma as something that feels too much, too fast, and too soon for our nervous system. So that is like in a big, if we were zooming out, that would be something that's traumatic. We often culturally, societally correlate trauma with things like being in the military or experiencing wartime violence, things that we would maybe classify, some people call them like big T traumas. So, life events, if you think about your life on kind of a linear scale, the moments that happen in your life that you think about my life before that moment and then my life after that moment. So it could be COVID, it could be a car accident, it could be the loss of someone that you really loved or cared about, it could be getting fired from a job or needing to move. Those punctuations in our timeline are moments that we reflect on and they change who we are. I don't typically like to pathologize or categorize these events as being bad or negative events. Sometimes they are for people, absolutely. And sometimes they're not. And there is a lot of reasons why our bodies organize and our minds organize our experiences into different ways. But just naming them as really influential moments or experiences that happen that kind of change the way we look at ourselves and change the way we interact with our communities or our relationships. More granularly, we think about trauma. I typically will put it in three different categories. So we can think about acute trauma, which would be, again, more of those single episode incidences where we do experience a car accident, or I already named I live in Colorado and our climate here can be a little apocalyptic. So we'll experience like floods and fires and other natural disasters that will impact people's safety and well being, uh, or things like single episode assaults. Those are what we call acute traumas. Then we have um, chronic traumas, and those would be things like childhood abuse or neglect. Those would be things like being in a domestic violence relationship or experiencing long stretches of poverty where you don't have access to your basic needs. being exposed to violent communities. So if you think about folks that are raised in like gang cultures or other communities that maybe where their environments are not consistently safe, their physical safety is regularly threatened. And then the third category that I often think of is called complex trauma. And that's where we experience chronic trauma at the hands of someone who is in a position of trust. Then we think
Mm.
about chronic sexual abuse, or we think about domestic violence, or we think about um, some of these other experiences where someone that we put our trust into has misused that and caused us harm. That is in a whole separate category. It's part of why culturally we react so big when we find out about teachers being abusive to children or clergy members acting in ways that are inappropriate with their congregation, because it's another layer of betrayal. And it's another, or mass shootings would be another one of like, it's not safe for me to go to the movie theater, or it's not safe for me to go to church, or it's not safe for me to go to school because these environments that I've been taught and told and conditioned to believe are safe for me to be in aren't anymore or aren't right now. Um, there's another layer where that really disrupts our sense of safety and our ability to navigate the world with choice.
100%. I could listen to you talk about this all day. I'm like, prepare the next question, Francesca. But no, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, if you think too about people, like you said, people that are being
Mhm.
abused at the hands of someone that they trust, if you think about like children that are either physically, emotionally, or sexually abused by caregivers, even siblings, cousins,
Mhm.
aunts, uncles, moms, dads, like
Family, friends.
family,
Mhm.
friends, there's so much of that. And I think a lot of it isn't talked about, but it's also very challenging for the survivor or victim, however they choose to identify themselves, to talk about that because you also don't want to ruin the reputation of someone that you love. You also don't want to see them get in trouble. And so it's so enmeshed and intertwined that it becomes so challenging to speak up and speak out about what's happened to you.
That's right. It also threatens, we don't live in a society where we believe people
Mm,
inherently, or that's not like our first reaction is to believe people, especially when it challenges our perception of that person. And so that's where we see this play out a lot when there are people who are in positions of power, like educators or clergy members or politicians,
mhm,
because it challenges the way I see this person. And I want to continue to access them in the way that has been really beneficial for me. See
mhm,
this I have a colleague that I work with who specializes in religious trauma, and I've shared professional spaces with her and conversations with other therapists or other like humans in the community. And I watch how complicated that is for other people to be able to hold the both and of my religious experience or my spiritual experience has been really healthy for me, and also holding that it's not always healthy for everyone. It it's hard for us to do that as humans because we want
yeah.
to believe that our experience is everyone's experience.
Mhm, yeah. Yeah. Oh my gosh. So many directions we could go in. Okay. I'd love to pick your brain a bit more, honestly, because this is something that I think is challenging. I mean, I'm someone who's studied this so much and I still find it challenging. So I can only imagine for like, someone walking into your room working on this stuff. Like, can you talk to us about the complex trauma that happens right at the
Mhm.
hands of someone that you trust? When you are abused by someone that you trust, especially in childhood, right? Because all of your
Mhm.
belief systems and your identity is still being formed. Can you talk to us about how how does that then impact the way in which you see the world, and what are some of the long-lasting effects that that has on people?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the answer in mental health is always it depends, right? Of
Sure.
like
Yeah.
everyone, there is a spectrum of response. I would say
Yeah.
that people typically trend in one direction or the other, where maybe like direction to the right would be in a response that we'll name as hypervigilance, which is when I like to describe it as like the volume is turned all the way up in our system. So we are constantly like scanning for threats. We are anticipating bad things happening. We are really jumpy, maybe. And so we startle really easily and really quickly. Can also find this showing up in anxious thoughts. So when our minds are kind of looping or we are running scenarios kind of indefinitely in our mind, can also be in what I'll name is like holding relationships with a closed fist instead of an open hand of I need to keep people really close to me, or I need to, like, if I can't touch you, you don't exist or you don't love me anymore. Um, just ultimately this feeling of being really unsettled. It's like a pop
Mhm.
can that hasn't been, like, there's no pressure that's been released and it's just holding. And then maybe the alternative response to that would be something we call hypoarousal, which is where we just maybe the volume is all the way down. And it's, if anyone listening remembers the like old Charlie Brown cartoon where you could like hear the teacher, but you can't actually hear what they're saying, where things maybe feel really muted or really fuzzy.
Mm.
Maybe this sense of like I'm kind of floating through my experiences or walking through water where everything feels like it takes a lot of effort. And I don't really feel super passionately or strongly about any one thing. I'm just trying to make it through today in this moment. I
Mhm.
would also name that people can experience both of those. So that can feel kind of like a ricochet back and forth between the two of like, I'm really engaged and over involved and really kind of like bracing myself for something. And then my system shuts down because I'm tired and I'm can't control the outcome anyway. And so then I start to feel kind of hopeless or under responsive as opposed to
Mhm.
over responsive. This feeling of like I'm taking my hands off the steering wheel, whatever happens, happens, and I'm not in control anyway. Um, and how that impacts people as far as their ability to make decisions or feel choice and agency in their life and their relationships is really significant. So it can be, again, I don't know how to make the right decision. I don't know, I don't believe that there is a right decision. I don't believe that there is a situation where I will be taken care of or understood. Um, and so it's not worth trying anyway. It's also, this is where we get into the dynamics in our lives where the devil we know is better than the devil we don't know. And so I have a good lay of this land, and sure there's problems, but the problems I know and they feel manageable and they feel predictable to a certain extent. And so I'm not even going to take the chance to hope or risk something being worse than this.
Wow, there's so many people that fall into these descriptions that you've given, and
Hmm.
thank you for making them so practical. I think
Yeah.
it can be easy sometimes for people in this field to use like the jargon of like the
Hmm.
therapy world. And so it's really helpful that you described what it may feel like for someone. And I
Hmm.
think it's important I was actually going to ask you, like, how does someone identify if they, fall into these sorts of
Yeah.
categories? But, you already answered that. So, and I think it's really helpful, right? Because it can also, I think it's mostly like at the beginning of doing a lot of trauma work, it's really just understanding and developing that awareness of like what's going on and what's happening. And so all the psychoeducation that goes into it, and mostly just to kind of like name it and acknowledge it
Hmm.
and understand it and normalize it. As someone who has experienced traumatic situations and had to do a bunch of trauma work and all that sorts of stuff,
Hmm.
it was so validating to understand like, oh, like how you were describing how we go from the hypo to the hyper
Hmm.
arousal. I was like,
Hmm.
yeah, I remember. And I still fall
Hmm.
into that sometimes, but I remember when I was fully in that, fully not aware of that. And so I was just like overdoing, overdoing, overdoing. And then I was like exhausted and would like crash. And then I was
Hmm.
like super hard on myself because I was in crash mode. And I was like, you're
Hmm.
supposed to be productive, this like society that we live in that you're supposed to be like a superwoman 24/7.
That's
Um,
right.
and so then just like how hard we are on ourselves because we're
Mhm,
not acting the way that we want to be acting. But it's
mhm,
like there's a whole like inner mechanism that
mhm.
was like it's like we were born for it to work, but then something got disrupted along the way. And
Yeah.
until you understand, and I love that you named a bunch of different examples, right? Because like we think of trauma as like, oh, well, I haven't been sexually abused, so it's not valid that I feel this way. And it's like, well, no, for
Mhm,
some people, losing your job can be extremely traumatic. Or growing up in an environment where, okay, none of the typical traumas happened, but maybe you
mhm,
grew up with a parent who is on the spectrum of narcissism or like
mhm,
grew up in poverty, like you said. And so it's just
mhm,
acknowledging there's so many different situations that can result in like the same type of response
mhm.
for different people, right?
Yeah, that's right. I think one that as you were talking, it reminded me that I didn't name neglect being on the
Mm.
spectrum from acute trauma to complex trauma, and also including neglect, which is the absence of people attuning to you, having access to your basic needs, um, being considered in what people are doing or how decisions are getting made. And it's not just the act of neglect that can feel traumatic to people, it's what neglect opens up to, right? Like when we are neglected as children, it means we are more at risk of being perpetrated against. It means we are inherently going to be in riskier situations because we don't have folks looking out for our safety and our protection in the same way. And so it just feels really important to name that as well.
Yeah.
Neglect also feels really ambiguous to people because it's not an episode. It's not something like sexual trauma that we can name or sexual abuse that we can name. It really is the absence of things that we needed, which include safety and belonging and connection.
Totally, totally. And I think the struggle with neglect, I find, is that also when you haven't had it, you don't even realize what you could have had.
That's right.
And so then you just kind of are like accustomed to, for lack of a better word, like the breadcrumbs or the neglect that you
Hmm.
get or whatever. And so then it's like, okay, to even believe that I deserve that or deserved that takes so much work to get to that
Yeah.
point.
Right. It also means that there is an acknowledgement at some point that I didn't get what I needed, which is
Mhm.
really threatening for us to consider because it threatens our relationships with our caregivers, it threatens our relationships with our partners or our immediate family. Um, because we have to also reconcile that, like, I love this person and the way that they loved me wasn't exactly what I needed, which is
Yeah.
really hard.
Yeah, I can imagine. And then it's like you're an adult and you're like
Hmm.
struggling for whatever reason. So you end up in your office and you're like, I need help.
Hmm.
And then it's challenging because once, like you said, you start to acknowledge what happened or what didn't happen, you have to also acknowledge that the people that were supposed to create that for you weren't
Hmm.
able to. And, ideally, from one day to another, you go through the whole process where you process the trauma, you process the anger, you process
Hmm.
the everything, and you love them again and you forgive
Hmm.
them and everything. But typically that doesn't happen. And typically what it takes a long time for yourself.
Hmm.
And then
Hmm.
typically when you do acknowledge, when you finally are able to be honest about what happened or what you lacked and the fact that you deserved it or didn't, and depending on the case, um, then when you try and maybe have a conversation with that person or those
Hmm.
people,
Hmm.
most people, not because they don't want to, but most people just aren't skilled at having those conversations. And so then they will just like project their own denial or, because that's how
Yeah.
they survived or their own like, well, my parents did worse. So like, what are you complaining about sort of attitude?
Yes.
And that can
Yes.
often be re-triggering for the person.
Mhm. Yeah, we do culturally and relationally engage in kind of trauma Olympics, right? Where it's like mine wasn't that bad, or mine was way
Yeah.
worse, or mine is more legitimate, or yours is way more legitimate. Because there is kind of a moving target in that it's not about the experience, it's about the impact of the experience.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes it hard for our brains. Like it doesn't compute. And
Yeah.
we are relational people at baseline, which means that we're always trying to figure out what makes sense about our experience and our feelings and what doesn't. And we do that by basing it off of other people's feelings and experiences, which, to your point, when you try and have hard conversations like this with people that you love, it brings up all of their shit, right? Because they
Yeah.
didn't or did get to do this or didn't
Yeah.
or did get validated for what happened to them. And when we can't kind of hold the both of this happened to you and it was really hard, and this happened to me and it was really hard, we
Mm.
do get in competitions. Like our systems get really competitive about this.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's hard to compare because it's like, I don't know, I think of, for example, I see this in a lot of like immigrant families. So like maybe
Mm-hmm,
the people that
mm-hmm.
immigrated were leaving like a dictatorship or a
That's
regime
right.
or
That's
poverty
right.
or like a horrific situation, and then
That's right.
their kids grow up, let's say in North America, with like all the access and privileges that you get in North America. And then
Mm-hmm.
they experience their mental health issues, and the
Mm-hmm.
parents are like, what are
You've
you
got to be kidding
complaining
me.
about? Like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. 100%.
yeah.
I used to work in like public schools. I would work in high schools and I would see this a lot where we had kids that their families had immigrated here from Mexico or other places in Central and South America.
Yeah.
And their kids, their teenagers were experiencing anxiety or they were feeling suicidal or they were depressed. And I would get these parents that were like, you've got to be kidding me. Like, I did
Yeah.
not work this hard to give
Yeah.
my child this life for them to not appreciate it.
Right.
And there is a certain element of there is luxury in being able to feel anxious and depressed,
Yes.
right? Like you have to have a certain element of safety in your
Yes.
life in order to even be able to tap into those feelings and
Yes.
move out of a place of survival.
Yeah.
Um, and like that's hard to explain to people because their orientation to the world is so different.
Right.
But knowing that that is part of why when things are over, quote unquote, is when
Hmm.
people's symptoms spike because they have the freedom, the time, the connection to their bodies to actually feel
Hmm.
what they're feeling, where that was not available to them while they were in it.
Yeah. I actually was wanted to ask you about that exactly because it's really challenging when you. So I'd love to know what you think about this. Actually, I was chatting with a
Yeah.
friend about this the other day, and they were struggling with their family doesn't quite understand or agree with this whole like mental health therapy, whatever. They're very much
Hmm.
in mental health therapy and whatever. And so obviously when they speak to their parents about it's kind of what we're talking about now. Like when they talk to their parents about all their
Hmm.
suffering, the parents are like, what are you talking about? We went through way worse,
Hmm.
whatever.
Hmm.
And I was trying to kind of explain to them that, in my opinion, trauma work is a privilege in a sense.
Hmm.
Like the fact that you can take the time out of your day to sit with a therapist and do the work,
Hmm.
and not just the hour that you meet with the therapist, but it's the time, like once you open up that box of Pandora, so many feelings come out, feelings that can be very destabilizing, feelings that can make it very challenging to do the regular day-to-day things that you were doing before, like going to work or
Hmm.
whatever. And so
Hmm.
when you're in that survival mode of like building something, to create
Hmm.
the access and privilege for your kids,
Hmm.
you can't afford to take time off to like take care. Self-care doesn't
Hmm.
exist
Hmm.
when you're in survival mode. You literally can't.
Hmm.
And so it's just, I think part of the challenge of being the generation that gets to heal or being the
Hmm.
cycle breaker. We all like to say, oh, I'm the
Hmm.
cycle breaker, I'm amazing. It's like,
Hmm.
well, you're amazing, yes, that you did this. And also just recognizing like you are technically in a position of privilege that you are even able to do this because maybe the people before you couldn't, like literally
That's right.
couldn't for whatever reason.
That's right. That's right. I would completely agree with that. I would also, it is like the unintended consequence or benefit of our ancestors or the generations before
Yeah.
us laying these foundations. Um, And it is a privilege. It is a privilege to be able to slow down and self-reflect. It is a privilege to be able to work through your symptoms instead of just like manage them and keep going. It
Yeah.
is a privilege to self-reflect and be introspective. Uh, and it's challenging. Like
Yeah.
it's not a luxury in the way of we think of
No.
like self-care, quote unquote.
Yeah.
Um, but it does prevent us from continuing to perpetuate harm on others
Hmm.
unintentionally.
Hmm.
It does offer so much opportunity for us to make friends with who we are and make friends with um, the things that have happened to us and that we
Hmm.
have been a part of, and to reflect on what we have inherited from those generations before us. So much of how we do categorize what happens in our lives is
Hmm.
inherited by the generations prior.
100%. Yeah. Yeah, and I love that because it's like I love how you also said like yes, it is a privilege, but it's not a luxury, right? Because it
Mhm.
doesn't feel great. Like after, it feels great. Like after you're like, wow,
Yeah,
all the hard work paid off, so worth it, so happy I did it.
totally.
But
Yeah.
during, it can be quite miserable at a few points there. And
Yeah.
community is great for that. Professional support is great for that. But I like kind of just like naming these sorts of things because I do see, and as someone who did this as well, it's like I think sometimes when we're on our healing journey and we're recovering from
Mhm.
this stuff, we kind of enter that phase of healing where we're like, I'm amazing. My parents suck because they didn't do this. And so
Yeah.
it's just kind of like, yes, and let's have compassion for the fact that maybe they weren't able to or they didn't know, or like,
Mhm.
there weren't like podcasts back then with people talking about trauma and therapy and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Like, not everyone literally had access to even a good professional or knowing that it even existed.
Well, and I think that's a really good point. And like this is a point of self-disclosure that I share pretty regularly, or when it's appropriate or necessary. But
Yeah.
I've worked with folks that have been experiencing trauma for 15 years or more at this point and administer all the assessments and know all of the facts and know all of the information. And the first time I ever met with a med provider, this is probably 2018. So I was well into it at this point. He administered a PTSD questionnaire, which again, I administer all the time. And
Mhm.
I'm going through this questionnaire and I'm answering these questions. And I get, I think there's like 28 questions on the questionnaire. I'm maybe 8 or 10 questions in, and I'm like, holy crap,
Mm.
I have PTSD, right? And I am educated and exposed and do a lot of research and had never had the opportunity or the time or made the time or the
Mhm.
opportunity
Mhm.
to reflect on my own experiences.
Right.
And so knowing that it's not just about access, it's also about the point of entry. Right.
Mm.
Prior to that, if I had had a therapist that was like, you have PTSD, I would have been like, okay.
Yeah.
I would not have picked up what they were putting down because I
Mhm.
wasn't in a stage of life where I had the opportunity to really reflect on what was happening in my life and how I was showing up. And
Yeah.
so I see that play out with clients all the time where they're like, what are you taught? Like this, I had never considered this, or I just thought
Right.
I was really burned out, or I thought that
Yeah.
the expectations were unreasonable and I just suck and I'm not motivated enough.
Yeah.
And when we can put the puzzle pieces together, it turns the light on in a totally new and different way.
Totally. Totally. 100%. Yeah. And that whole thing of like, I love how you said the point of entry because,
Hmm.
and that's like such a nuanced discussion in a sense, because
Hmm.
I think about too, like, I think about the discussion around, therapy not being financially accessible. And I agree,
Yeah.
like
Hmm.
100%. The system is not exactly supporting therapists financially, and they're not exactly supporting people to access therapy financially. So
That's
on
right.
both ends, we're all struggling here. We're all trying to
Hmm.
figure out how to make more money, how to serve our clients better, how to make it more accessible, but also like survive ourselves. Anyway, that's a whole other
Hmm.
discussion. My point is that it is very nuanced because at the same time, there is a lot of free support and help out there. Like there are free
Yeah.
12-step groups, there are free support groups, there are um hundreds and thousands of books probably at this point and
Hmm.
podcasts and content and all that stuff. But what you said is so true is like it's not that there isn't information out there. There's so much. We're making it right now. But
Yeah.
are you able to access that information? It's like sometimes you read
Yeah.
a book and it means nothing to you, and then you read it 5 years later and you're like, oh my God, this is the most
Hmm.
life-changing thing I've ever
Hmm.
read. Like there's plenty of people around me that have heard me say therapeutic things all the time, and they're just like, okay, here goes Francie with her like therapy talk again, you
Yeah.
know? And then there's
Yeah.
people around me that hear it and they're like, whoa, that was like a light bulb moment. And it's like, but I
Yeah.
can't force you to have that light bulb moment. You have to be in a state in your life where you're ready to receive that information and you're ready to maybe even like I learned a long time ago this whole thing that was like, don't force someone to work on themselves because maybe they're not ready to like open that
Yeah.
up. They might not have the skills and tools and the support and the internal skills and tools to work through that. So it's like,
Yes.
if you see someone that's struggling, sure, let them know that help is available. But more than that, let them get there on their own because maybe now is not the time where it's the right
Hmm.
moment. Like we don't know. We can't play God. We don't know when is the right moment for them to work on
Hmm.
themselves.
Hmm. Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think when we force an agenda on
Mm,
ourselves or anyone else,
mm,
it tends to activate all the things that we're struggling with already, right? So if
yeah,
someone is forcing an agenda upon you, it does activate feelings of shame and feelings of fear and feelings of defensiveness and self-protection, as it should, because it's not a shared goal.
yeah, yeah. 100%. And I think it goes back to that whole idea that you were saying of, I love how you described it, like holding a relationship
Hmm.
rather like holding tight to it rather than with an
Hmm.
open hand.
Hmm.
And, you see that a lot, whether it's like because of your attachment or, what you've been through in life. But yeah, I think it's that whole idea of like not being able to just like relax and trust that things are
Hmm.
going to work out for you
Hmm.
and that you obviously need to be an active protagonist and them working out for you, but there's such a balance that needs to be striked between the gripping and like the full I give up,
Hmm.
you
Hmm.
know.
Right.
Yeah.
And it makes a lot of sense for people to not believe that everything's going to work out for them if it
Yeah.
hasn't to this point,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like that feels like asking someone to just walk on their hands or speak Chinese
Right.
when they have no baseline or context for things are going to work out for me.
Right, right. And it's like to the person that lived the 3%
Hmm.
chance, you can't
Hmm.
tell them, oh, but there's only a 3% chance. It's like, dude, I lived that. Like, I know that it can happen again because
That's
I've already
right.
been through it.
That's right. So it is when we're doing trauma work too, it is about feelings, not about facts, right? Like
Hmm.
we're not talking about people are good people or bad people, things make sense or they don't make sense. We're talking about how it feels in your system and
Hmm.
what your experience is on this planet. And when we can divest from the making sense of it, is when we open up a lot of opportunity. And we do that through healing relationships. We do that through corrective experiences. We do that through um, feeling like we can take calculated risks, both relationally, interpersonally, and in our decisions. And when those things work out well, then we're building new muscle memory. But until that
Yeah.
happens, it's unreasonable to ask someone to just like take a leap of faith.
Yeah. No. No,
Mhm.
100%. Fully shifting gears here. What
Yeah.
is some someone who's listening right now who maybe is like relating to this a lot, what are some, whether it's just like strategies or like piece of advice that you would share with them?
Mhm. Mhm. I would start with taking inventory of your community and your support system and saying, Not necessarily with a like a lens of judgment or a lens of this person is good for me or not good for me. And back to, you've named some other things that we culturally have just adopted of we're not necessarily looking for toxic relationships or identifying which relationships are toxic. We're just
Mm-hmm.
looking for where are the gaps and opportunities. So if I have this person and this person and this person, or I just have one person, or I don't feel like I have anyone, then it's an opportunity for us to say, like, maybe I should find someone. I should open up
Mm-hmm.
to whether it is a professional support or an interpersonal support, of how can I let more people in my life. If that feels really scary and inaccessible for folks, I get that too. And that's when we can open ourselves up to other resources. So, can I be listening to podcasts? Can I be reading books? Can I be watching YouTube videos from people that are offering support in different ways or understanding in different ways? I do want to plug a book that I read over the summer just
Mm-hmm.
recently that was really beautiful and helpful called What My Bones Know by Stephanie Fu. And
Ooh.
it's a book about her experience with complex PTSD. She's obviously been interviewed in a ton of podcasts if you're interested in that as well. Um, and what I appreciate about her experience or her shared experience is there is a lot of what she is doing on her healing journey that other people can really relate to, as far as this deep desire to be connected, but also this huge fear of being rejected or abandoned. This deep see this like need to be seen as efficient and effective, but also this paralyzing fear of being an imposter.
Mm.
And when we see representation matters in really big ways, and that's true for our mental health as well. And so finding other spaces and places where you can resonate with someone's experience or their story or their worldviews can help us feel less alone.
I think that's such a great starting point, like just being able to find someone else's story that you can relate to that can just help you
Mhm.
feel like, okay, I'm not the only one dealing with this.
Yeah,
Because I
that's
think
right.
once you find that one person, then
Mhm.
you can kind of open yourself up even just to the idea that there's other people.
That's
If
right.
you choose to go meet them, that's your decision, that's up to you to figure out if it's supportive to
Mhm.
you. But I think that really does make a huge difference because, like you said, our society has such a hard time believing people. And so then
Mhm.
I might not even like fully credit or believe myself. And so
That's right.
just finding someone else that's like, no, this is what I went through and it's valid and it's significant and this is the effects that it had on me. And you get to read that and you're like, okay,
Mhm.
maybe what I went through wasn't like, maybe it was a big deal. Like maybe it did
Or it
impact me.
wasn't me, right? Like it
Right.
wasn't me. The reason I
Yeah.
feel impacted is not because I'm weak or I'm dramatic or whatever other stories we
Right.
tell ourselves.
Right. Or like I didn't
Yeah.
cause it or something. Like this
Mhm.
is,
Mhm.
yeah. I think it's cool because a lot of it too, I mean, I don't know if it's cool, maybe there's me geeking out on, the psych stuff, but I think it is really cool because then you get to a point where you get to just like change the narrative and the story of what happened to you. And that completely changes the way in which you think about yourself,
Mhm.
which is like
Yeah.
just such a gift that we get to have when we are able to work on ourselves.
It's a whole new point on the timeline, right? So it's not
Yeah.
just the car accident and the COVID and the sexual assault. It's like,
Yeah.
oh, this is the moment where I realized that it wasn't me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
And it really does, at least speaking from my own personal experience, when I started to get in touch with all that and be able to share it with people, the right people and everything. But
Yeah,
I got to a level where then I got to create like real intimate relationships with people where we talked about like the real stuff in life
that's right.
and you get to have like a real community with real support around you. And
Mhm.
sure, friends to do activities with is wonderful. We all love that. But we also need people that we can like actually talk about what's happening in our lives and
Yeah,
get support.
right. Seen and
Um,
be seen. Hmm.
yeah. Oh my gosh. I could keep talking to you forever. I love like all the therapist wisdom coming out of you.
Yeah.
But I will let you go. Before then, can you please tell us where people can find you?
Yeah, so the group practice I own is called Two Rivers Therapy and Consulting. And you can find my website at tworiverstherapycolorado.com, same handle on Instagram. Um, and I would love to connect with folks if they have questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Anne, for being here. Thank you for sharing all of your expertise with us and letting me pick your brain. And with that, thank you so much for listening. If you like what you heard, feel free to like, subscribe, follow, share this episode with someone that you think might find it helpful and supportive.